They're out there. They're coming for me. The camera cuts to her clutching a knife, hiding in the shadows of her RV as a shadowy figure moves past the window. A flashlight beam sweeps across the blinds. The handle of the RV door jiggles violently. "Come out, Jessica!" a calm, menacing voice calls. Jessica grabs her dog, Bailey, pulling him close to muffle his growls. The knocking grows louder. A loud bang startles her, and she whispers, "How did it come to this?" If you want more chilling stories like this, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to share this with your friends. They won't believe what happens next. Hashtag Part 1. The Escape to Solitude. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon as I drove my RV down the dusty road leading into the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. The swamp stretched endlessly on either side, thick with towering cypress trees draped in moss. This was exactly what I needed, a complete disconnect from the chaos of life. No deadlines, no city noise, just the serenity of nature and the sound of Bailey's soft breathing in the passenger seat. Bailey, my loyal Labrador retriever, had been my companion through thick and thin. He wagged his tail lazily as we pulled into a small, isolated campsite tucked away near the water's edge. The area was perfect, a quiet spot surrounded by trees with no other campers in sight. I parked the RV, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of damp earth, but it felt refreshing, a reminder that I was far from the city. I set up a small fire pit and prepared a quick dinner as Bailey explored the area, sniffing at every bush and tree. The swamp was alive with sound. Crickets chirped in the underbrush, frogs croaked. From the water and the occasional splash hinted at something unseen just below the surface. For a moment I felt completely at peace. But as the last light of day faded, that peace began to waver. It started with the sound of a faint splash. I turned toward the water, squinting into the growing darkness, but saw nothing. Probably a fish or a bird, I told myself, shaking off the unease. Still, Bailey's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. "What is it, boy?" I asked, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stood frozen, staring toward the dense tree line. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees. Nothing moved. The swamp was eerily still for a moment, as though holding its breath. Then the usual sounds resumed. Bailey relaxed and lay down by the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Determined not to let my imagination ruin the trip, I went inside the RV, locked the doors, and crawled into bed. Bailey settled at my feet, and the hum of the generator provided a comforting background noise. As I drifted off to sleep, I reminded myself that I had come here for peace and solitude. Whatever was out there, it couldn't be anything more than wildlife. But the uneasy feeling lingered. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of Bailey barking. He was at the window, his teeth bared, growling at something outside. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight, the beam casting long shadows across the walls. "Bailey, stop!" I whispered, trying to calm him down. I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The moonlight illuminated the swamp, but nothing seemed out of place. No shadows moved, no figures lurked. Still, Bailey wouldn't settle. "Probably a raccoon or something," I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. I double-checked the locks on the RV door, then climbed back into bed, my heart still pounding. It was only the first night, and already, I felt like I wasn't alone. Hashtag Part 1. The Escape to Solitude, second 500 words. The next morning, the swamp looked entirely different in the daylight. The golden rays of the sun filtered through the cypress trees, casting dappled light on the ground. The oppressive darkness of the night seemed like a distant memory. Bailey wagged his tail eagerly, as if he, too, felt the shift in mood. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. Armed with a map of the refuge, a flashlight, and a small knife, just in case, I set out with Bailey leading the way. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, and the sound of the swamp came alive again. Frogs croaked, birds sang, and the occasional splash of water hinted at unseen creatures below the surface. About 20 minutes into the hike, I spotted something odd. Tied to the base of a large cypress tree was an old, weathered canoe. Its paint was chipped, and the wood looked like it had seen better days. But what struck me as strange was the fact that it was tethered so far from any obvious waterway. Bailey sniffed around the area, his nose working overtime. The ground was muddy, but there were no fresh footprints, just the faint imprint of old ones, faded and barely discernible. Probably a ranger's canoe, I muttered to myself, though I wasn't sure why a ranger would leave it there. A nagging feeling tugged at the back of my mind, but I shrugged it off. Continuing down the trail, the swamp grew denser, and the light filtered through less and less. The path narrowed, branches and vines occasionally snagging at my clothes. Bailey stayed close, his usual enthusiasm dampened by the increasingly eerie surroundings. That's when I saw it. Hidden behind a wall of moss and twisted vines was an old wooden cabin. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging and the windows broken. Something about the structure sent a shiver down my spine. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong here. I hesitated, glancing at Bailey. He whined softly, his tail tucked between his legs. "I know, boy. This is weird," I said, my voice low. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed to the front door, which hung slightly ajar. Inside, the faint smell of mildew and decay wafted. Peering in, I saw a single room filled with broken furniture, dirt, and leaves scattered across the floor. On a rickety table in the corner lay what looked like a notebook. Curiosity got the better of me. The notebook's cover was cracked, and its pages were brittle. Scrawled across the top of the first page were the words, "They're watching. Always watching." Bailey growled low in his throat, his eyes fixed on something in the trees. I turned, scanning the dense foliage, but saw nothing. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the sunlight didn't feel so reassuring anymore. Part 1, The Escape to Solitude. Third 500 words. I didn't linger at the cabin. Something about the place felt wrong, as though the swamp itself was warning me to leave. Clutching the brittle notebook, I stepped back outside, my footsteps crunching against the wooden planks of the porch. Bailey stayed close to my side, his growl still rumbling low in his throat. "Come on, boy," I whispered, glancing back at the cabin one last time. The open doorway seemed darker than before, as if the shadows inside had grown thicker. I shook the thought away and headed back toward the RV. The hike back felt longer, the swamp's noises more pronounced. Every rustle of leaves and distant splash made my heart jump. Bailey, usually so full of energy, stayed unnaturally quiet, his ears flicking at every sound. I tried to focus on the trail ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to the words scrawled in the notebook. They're watching. Always watching. What had happened in that cabin? And who was they? By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the ground. I set the notebook on the small counter inside the RV and busied myself making dinner. Bailey sat by the door, his eyes fixed on the window, as if expecting something or someone to appear. After eating, I finally mustered the courage to open the notebook again. The pages were filled with frantic, messy handwriting. Most of it was incomprehensible, but certain phrases jumped out at me. They come at night. Asterisk. Don't look them in the eyes. Asterisk. The swamp belongs to them. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages. Near the end of the notebook, the handwriting became more erratic. The words slanted and uneven. The final entry read, "If you're reading this, it's already too late." I slammed the notebook shut, my heart racing. Bailey let out a bark, startling me. I turned to see him standing rigid, staring out the window. "What is it, Bailey?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I approached the window cautiously, peering out into the dimly lit swamp. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the underbrush seemed still. For a moment, I saw nothing unusual. Then, at the edge of the clearing, something moved. It was just a shadow, a fleeting glimpse of something tall and thin slipping between the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to see, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. I locked the RV door, double-checking the windows and turning on every light inside. Bailey barked again, his tail tucked between his legs. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, scanning the clearing. Nothing. "It's just the swamp playing tricks," I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But the words in the notebook echoed in my mind. They come at night. That night, I lay awake in bed, clutching Bailey close as the sounds of the swamp seemed to close in around us. I told myself it was nothing. Just wildlife, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. The swamp wasn't empty, and neither was the cabin. I ignored the signs, the footprints, the bloody handprint, the whispers at night. By the time I realized the truth, it was too late. A loud bang against the door breaks the tension, followed by a low, chilling voice. "Come out, Jessica. I just want to talk." What do you think Jessica should do next? Tell us in the comments. And if this story has you hooked, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The scariest part is just getting started. Hashtag part 2. The unsettling signs. First 500 words. The morning sun broke through the swamp's dense canopy, casting long streaks of light across my RV. I barely slept that night. Every rustle outside, every creak of the RV's frame felt amplified, like something, or someone, was just waiting for me to let my guard down. Bailey seemed to feel it too. He was unusually quiet, staying close to my side as I brewed coffee and tried to shake the unease that lingered from the night before. My mind kept going back to that cabin and the notebook with its cryptic, chilling warnings. I told myself it was just the ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time alone out here. But a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What if it's not?" Determined to push past my nerves, I decided to hike back to the cabin and see if there was anything I missed. Maybe there were more clues that could explain the notebook or the strange atmosphere around the swamp. It was probably just my imagination, I reasoned. I grabbed my backpack, packed a few essentials, water, a flashlight, my knife, and set off with Bailey trotting cautiously beside me. The swamp felt different that morning. The usual lively sounds of birds and insects seemed muted, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. When I reached the cabin, it looked just as decrepit as before, its sagging roof and broken windows untouched. Bailey hesitated on the porch, whining softly. "It's okay, boy," I said, more to convince myself than him. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, thick with the scent of mildew and rot. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof, illuminating the room in patches. I noticed things I hadn't seen during my first visit, scratches on the walls that looked like claw marks, and piles of dirt in the corners as if something had been digging there. On the far side of the cabin, a wooden table held what looked like remnants of someone's belongings, a rusted lantern, a broken pocket watch, and a stack of faded photographs. The photos showed a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children standing in front of a house. But something about the photos was disturbing. Their faces were scratched out, leaving deep gouges in the paper. My stomach churned as I flipped through them. Who would do this? And why? Bailey growled suddenly, his fur bristling. I turned to see him staring at the far corner of the room, his eyes locked on something I couldn't see. "What is it, Bailey?" I whispered, my hand instinctively reaching for my knife. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like a floorboard bending under someone's weight. I froze, holding my breath. The sound came again, this time from outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal, it was deliberate. Someone, or something, was out there. Hashtag Part 2. The Unsettling Signs, second 500 words. I stood frozen in the middle of the cabin, every muscle in my body tense. Bailey's growls grew deeper, his eyes fixed on the door. The faint creaking outside came again, this time followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the brittle leaves surrounding the cabin. My mind raced. Maybe it was a ranger, or another camper. Maybe it was someone looking for help. But something about the slow, deliberate nature of the sound sent a chill up my spine. "Stay quiet, Bailey," I whispered, crouching down to stroke his head, though my hand was trembling. I moved toward the window, keeping low, and peeked through the shattered glass. At first I saw nothing, just the dense swamp, its trees swaying slightly in the breeze. But then I noticed it, a figure, partially obscured by the shadows, standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall, too tall to be anyone I'd expect to see out here. Its shape was humanoid, but there was something off about the way it stood, slightly hunched as if watching, waiting. My heart pounded as I squinted, trying to make out more details. And then, it moved. The figure stepped closer, its movement slow and unnatural, like it wasn't fully in control of its limbs. My breath hitched as it reached the edge of the clearing. I could see it more clearly now, a man, or at least what looked like a man. His clothes were tattered and smeared with mud, his head tilted at an odd angle as though he was listening for something. Bailey barked suddenly, the sharp sound breaking the tension. The figure stopped, its head snapping toward the cabin. I ducked down, my back pressed against the wall, my heart racing. "Shh, Bailey," I whispered, pulling him close. But it was too late. The footsteps resumed, heavier this time, heading straight for the cabin. I tightened my grip on my knife, my mind cycling through options. Should I run? Hide? Confront whoever or whatever was outside? None of the choices felt safe. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with silence. And then I heard it, a faint scratching, like fingernails dragging across the wood. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steadier than I expected. No answer, just more scratching, deliberate and slow, as if whoever was outside wanted me to know they were there. Bailey barked again, snapping me out of my paralysis. I decided I couldn't just sit and wait. Clutching the knife, I moved toward the back of the cabin where a small, broken window offered a potential escape route. I hoisted myself through, landing awkwardly on the damp ground outside. Bailey followed, his tail tucked between his legs. I crouched low, listening, trying to gauge where the figure was. The footsteps had stopped. But as I turned to look back at the cabin, I saw it again, standing just outside the doorway, its head tilted, watching me. Hashtag Part 2, The Unsettling Signs, third 500 words. I didn't wait to see what the figure would do next. Grabbing Bailey's leash, I bolted, ducking low as I ran toward the trees. My boots squished in the swampy ground, each step feeling like it dragged me further into a waking nightmare. Bailey stayed close, his ears pinned back and his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The swamp seemed to close in around us. The dense canopy above blocked out much of the sunlight, casting the path in an eerie twilight. My flashlight bounced in my hand as I ran, the beam flickering across the trees. Every shadow looked like it could move. Every rustle felt like a threat. Behind me, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. They weren't running, but they didn't need to. It was as if the swamp itself was on their side, helping them keep pace with me. "Come on, Jess," I muttered under my breath, willing myself to keep moving. "Just get back to the RV." Bailey suddenly pulled at the leash, dragging me to the left, off the main trail. His instinct overrode mine, and I trusted him. Veering into the denser part of the swamp. The footing was uneven, and I stumbled several times, scraping my hands on jagged roots and fallen branches. But Bailey pressed on, guiding me through the maze of trees and undergrowth. The footsteps behind us grew fainter, but they didn't stop. Whoever, or whatever it was, they weren't giving up. After what felt like an eternity, we broke through the trees into a small clearing. My lungs burned from exertion, and my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop moving. Across the clearing, I spotted a faint glimmer of metal, the RV. Relief surged through me like a tidal wave. "Almost there," I gasped, tugging Bailey along. As we reached the RV, I fumbled with the keys, my shaking hands struggling to fit the right one into the lock. Behind me, the forest was unnervingly silent. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. The lock finally clicked open, and I shoved the door wide, pulling Bailey inside before slamming it shut and locking it behind us. I collapsed against the door, gasping for air, as Bailey paced nervously, his tail still tucked between his legs. For a few minutes, I just sat there, listening to the pounding of my heart and the faint hum of the RV's generator. Outside, the swamp was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, no sounds of water, just silence. I crept to the window, peering through the blinds. At first, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, near the edge of the clearing, something moved. The figure stood partially obscured by the trees, watching the RV. This time, it didn't tilt its head or make any noise. It just stood there, completely still. The silence was deafening, and my stomach churned with dread. It wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't human. Hashtag part 2, the unsettling signs, fourth 500 words. I sat frozen by the window, barely breathing as I stared at the figure lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing. It hadn't moved since I first spotted it, but that made it even more unnerving. Its stillness felt deliberate, like it was waiting for something, waiting for me. Bailey's low growl broke the silence inside the RV. He stood at my side, his body tense, his eyes locked on the same spot where the figure stood. I couldn't tear my gaze away, half expecting it to lunge forward at any moment. "Okay, Jess," I whispered to myself, trying to steady my nerves. "You've got to think this through." The RV suddenly felt like a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was out there. My mind raced with questions. Should I try to scare it off? Call for help? Leave? But the nearest town was miles away, and my RV wasn't exactly built for off-road speed. I felt trapped, and that realization sent a fresh wave of panic washing over me. Then, it moved. It was subtle, a slow step forward, just enough to bring its full body into the light. My blood ran cold as I took in its appearance. It was definitely human, or it had been once. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly across its bones, like it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its clothes hung in tatters, smeared with mud and something darker that I didn't want to think about. But the worst part was its face. The features were all wrong. The eyes were too wide, the mouth stretched into an unnatural grin that seemed frozen in place, and it was staring right at me. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Bailey barked now, loud and sharp, his fur bristling as he paced back and forth. "Shh, Bailey, quiet," I whispered, though my voice was shaking. The figure took another step toward the RV, its head tilting slightly to one side as if it were curious. My stomach churned as it raised one hand and pointed directly at the RV. No, not at the RV, at me. I scrambled to grab my phone, fumbling as I tried to dial for help. My fingers shook so badly that I nearly dropped it, and when I finally managed to press the buttons, the screen blinked. With a horrifying message, "No service." "Damn it!" I hissed, slamming the phone onto the counter. The figure was closer now, just at the edge of the RV's headlights. It raised its other hand and scratched at its neck, the sound grating and unnatural, like fingernails on dry bark. I backed away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. I grabbed my knife from the kitchen counter and clutched it tightly, my mind racing. I had no weapons, no real way to defend myself if it tried to get in. And then, as if reading my thoughts, it took another step forward. I knew one thing for sure, it wasn't going to stop. Hashtag Part 3. The presence felt, first 500 words. The air inside the RV was suffocating, heavy with the tension of the moment. Bailey stood near the door, his growls vibrating through the small space, while I paced back and forth, trying to come up with a plan. My mind felt foggy, cluttered with fear and panic. I couldn't stay in the RV, but leaving seemed just as dangerous. Peeking through the blinds, I saw the figure again, still at the edge of the clearing. It hadn't moved for several minutes, its face frozen in that grotesque, too-wide grin. For a moment, I wondered if it was a trick of the light, or maybe even some sort of scarecrow. But no scarecrow moved like that. And no scarecrow made you feel like its eyes were boring into your soul. I double-checked the locks on the door and grabbed my flashlight. If I had to run, I'd need to see where I was going. My knife was still clutched in my hand, its handle slick with sweat. Bailey barked suddenly, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Quiet, Bailey!" I hissed, though I couldn't blame him. Every instinct in my body was telling me to scream, to run, to do something other than stand here, frozen in fear. Then I heard it, a new sound that sent shivers down my spine. It started as a faint tapping, like fingers lightly drumming against the RV. At first I thought it was coming from the roof, but then it moved, circling the RV in slow, deliberate steps. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat as the sound grew louder, closer. Bailey barked again, this time lunging at the door. His claws scraped against the floor as he growled, teeth bared. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear past the drumming. A low, guttural hum reached my ears, a voice, though I couldn't make out the words. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The tapping stopped. Silence enveloped the RV, the kind of silence that made the air feel heavier, thicker. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. Anything. And then came the whisper. "Jessica." My name, spoken softly but unmistakably, floated through the stillness like a ghostly caress. My knees buckled, and I had to grab the counter to steady myself. "No," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But it was real. I turned off all the lights inside the RV, hoping to make myself less of a target. Darkness swallowed the small space, leaving me with only the faint moonlight streaming through the blinds. My heart pounded as I peeked out the window again. The figure was gone. For a moment, relief flooded through me. Maybe it had left. Maybe it had been scared off. But deep down, I knew better. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows inside the RV. And that's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of breathing. Inside. Hashtag part 3. The presence felt, second 500 words. I froze, my entire body going cold. The sound was faint but undeniable. Shallow, deliberate breathing coming from inside the RV. Bailey was still growling near the door, which meant whoever, or whatever, was with us wasn't him. My grip on the knife tightened, the metal biting into my palm. "Who?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best effort to stay calm. No response. The breathing continued, slow and steady, as though whoever it was had all the time in the world. I flicked on my flashlight and swung the beam across the small space of the RV. The pale light illuminated the bed, the kitchenette, the cramped table, but nothing seemed out of place. No shadows moved, no figures lurked. Bailey's growls deepened, his ears pinned back. He wasn't staring at the door anymore. He was looking at the bathroom. The tiny bathroom door was closed, though I was certain I hadn't shut it. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a hesitant step forward. The breathing was louder now, as though it were just on the other side of the door. "Get out!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Armed, and I'm not afraid to use this." The breathing stopped. Silence hung in the air, suffocating and oppressive. For a moment, I thought maybe it had been in my head. Maybe my fear was playing tricks on me, making me hear things that weren't really there. But then, the doorknob rattled. My blood turned to ice as the handle twisted slowly, deliberately, and the door creaked open a fraction of an inch. The gap was small, but it was enough to see the darkness beyond. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as though the batteries were suddenly failing. Come on, I muttered, shaking the flashlight. The door swung open. At first there was nothing, just the empty bathroom, its sink and mirror reflecting my terrified face. But then I noticed something in the corner, just behind the shower curtain. A shadow moved, barely perceptible but enough to make my stomach drop. "Get out!" I screamed, stepping back and raising the knife in front of me. The curtain shifted slightly, the faintest ripple of motion. And then, with a sudden, violent burst, something lunged from behind it. I screamed, stumbling backward as the shape rushed toward me. The flashlight fell from my hand, clattering to the floor, and Bailey's barking reached a fever pitch. I slashed blindly with the knife, the blade cutting through empty air as the thing disappeared into the darkness. I scrambled to grab the flashlight, its beam flickering wildly as I swung it around the RV. The door was wide open now, swinging on its hinges, and Bailey was barking at the empty doorway. Whatever had been inside was gone. For now. But my relief was short-lived. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of footsteps, retreating into the swamp. And with them the low guttural hum of a voice I couldn't understand. Hashtag part 3. The presence felt, third 500 words. I slammed the RV door shut, my fingers fumbling to lock it. The footsteps outside faded into the swamp, but my heart kept pounding, as though it hadn't caught up with the fact that the immediate danger was gone. Bailey circled the small space, his growls turning to uneasy whines. "Shh, it's okay, boy," I whispered, even though I knew it wasn't. I wasn't sure who I was trying to reassure, Bailey or myself. The flashlight flickered again, so I grabbed a spare set of batteries from the drawer, my hands trembling as I swapped them in. The steadier beam did little to calm my nerves, but at least I could see now. I swept the light around the RV, double-checking every corner, every shadow. The bathroom was empty. So was the kitchenette. There was no sign of the figure I had seen, no sign of anyone breaking in. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced at the window, the blinds still half drawn. Cautiously, I peeked out, the flashlight casting faint reflections on the glass. The swamp was still and silent, the moonlight creating long, distorted shadows among the trees. At first I saw nothing, then a flicker of movement. At the edge of the clearing the figure stood once more, just barely visible between the gnarled trunks of the cypress trees. It wasn't moving this time. It simply stood there, watching. I squinted, trying to make out more details. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me, curious and calculating. "Why won't you just go away?" I muttered under my breath, gripping the flashlight tightly. Bailey let out a low, rumbling growl, his ears pinned back. I looked down at him, my throat dry. He wasn't growling at the figure outside anymore. He was looking toward the floor. I followed his gaze, shining the flashlight down. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Fresh, muddy footprints tracked across the floor of the RV, leading from the bathroom to the door. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. Whoever, or whatever, had been inside hadn't left through the door. I slowly knelt down, examining the footprints more closely. They were large and irregular, as though whoever made them had been barefoot and dragging their feet. The mud was still damp, meaning they couldn't have been made long ago. Bailey barked sharply, snapping my attention back to the window. The figure was gone again. My stomach dropped. "Where?" I whispered, barely able to finish the question. A loud thud sounded from the roof of the RV, and I jumped to my feet, nearly dropping the flashlight. The noise came again, heavier this time, like something, or someone, was moving above me. I held my breath. Bailey barked furiously, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. Then, from just above my head, I heard it. A slow, deliberate scraping, like nails dragging across metal. Whatever it wasn't done with me yet. Hashtag part 3. The presence felt. Fourth 500 words. The scraping sound above me was relentless, deliberate, like it was testing the strength of the RV's roof. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stood frozen, staring upward, knife clutched tightly in my hand. Bailey's barking echoed through the small space, each sharp sound amplifying the tension. "Quiet, Bailey!" I hissed, though my voice was shaky. I wasn't sure if I was trying to quiet him to avoid provoking whatever was on the roof, or to keep myself from losing control entirely. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Bailey fell silent too, but his body remained tense, his gaze locked on the ceiling. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it had gone. Maybe the thing, whatever it was, had decided to leave. Thump. The sudden heavy impact made the RV shudder, nearly knocking me off balance. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. Whatever was on the roof wasn't just testing the RV anymore. It was moving, its footsteps deliberate and slow, tracing a path toward the back of the vehicle. Moved cautiously toward the window, peeking out into the darkness. The swamp was still and lifeless, but the faint reflection of the RV in the water caught my attention. On the roof, I could see its outline, a hunched figure, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, crawling slowly along the metal surface. My heart sank. It wasn't just standing up there. It was looking for a way in. The footsteps moved again, this time toward the roof vent. I knew the vent wasn't meant to withstand a direct assault. It was just a flimsy piece of plastic. My mind raced, searching for a plan. I couldn't just stay in here, waiting for it to break through. Bailey barked again, leaping at the door as if he sensed my panic. "No, boy," I said sharply, grabbing his collar to hold him back. His growls deepened, his focus shifting back to the ceiling as another loud scrape echoed above us. And then a new sound, a faint rattling. It was the vent. I watched in horror as it began to shift, the screws groaning under pressure. The figure was prying it open. "Not happening," I muttered, my voice laced with terror. I grabbed a metal pole I used for adjusting the blinds and aimed it toward the vent, holding it like a makeshift spear. My flashlight flickered as I stood beneath the vent, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. With a loud crack, the vent popped open, and a hand, long, thin, and disturbingly pale, reached inside. I didn't think. I jabbed upward with the pole, striking the hand hard enough to make it recoil. A guttural, inhuman screech filled the air, echoing through the swamp. The figure scrambled back, retreating toward the edge of the roof. I held my makeshift weapon tightly, my chest heaving. Outside, I heard a loud splash, and when I peered through the window again, the figure was gone, into the swamp, swallowed by the darkness. But I knew it wasn't over. It wasn't running. It was waiting. Hashtag Part 3. The presence felt, fifth 500 words. The swamp felt eerily silent after the figure vanished into the darkness. My hands trembled as I lowered the makeshift pole, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, leaving me shaky and disoriented. Bailey whimpered softly, pressing against my leg. I knelt beside him, running a hand over his fur in a futile attempt to calm both of us. "It's gone," I whispered, though the words felt like a lie. I scanned the swamp through the windows, every shadow looking like it could shift into something sinister. The RV felt fragile, as though the thin walls couldn't possibly keep out whatever was hunting me. The vent above was cracked open, letting in cool air and a faint scent of the swamp, damp, earthy, and tinged with decay. I knew I couldn't stay here. It was clear now that this thing, this presence, wasn't just some wandering hermit or a freak of nature. It was calculated, deliberate. It wanted me, and it wasn't going to stop. Grabbing my map, I laid it out on the table and traced a route back to the main road. If I could make it there, I might find a ranger. Or another camper, someone who could help. The swamp was dense, but I'd driven in far enough to remember at least part of the way back. But then I remembered the muddy footprints inside the RV. The memory sent a cold chill down my spine. The figure had been inside. It wasn't just a creature stalking me from the shadows. It had crossed that threshold. It had been close enough to touch me. I shoved the thought aside and began packing supplies. I didn't know what might happen, but I wanted to be ready. Water, a flashlight, batteries, the knife, everything I could think of went into my backpack. The plan was simple. I'd drive as fast as I could, and if the RV got stuck, I'd run. Bailey growled low in his throat, pulling me from my thoughts. His body stiffened as his eyes fixed on the window nearest. I followed his gaze, gripping the knife tightly as I crept toward the blinds. Slowly I lifted a corner to peek outside. At first I saw nothing but the still swamp, the pale moonlight reflecting off the dark water. Then, just as I was about to relax, movement caught my A figure emerged from the shadows near the tree line, its grotesque, elongated limbs gliding unnaturally. My stomach churned as I realized there wasn't just one figure. Another stepped out beside it, and then another. 3 of them now, all standing in the moonlight, their heads tilted in unison as they stared directly at the RV. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The thought of leaving the RV now felt impossible. And then the noise began again, the slow, deliberate tapping. This time, it came from all around the RV, on the walls, the windows, the roof. A chorus of knocks that grew louder, more erratic, as if they were trying to drive me mad. Bailey barked furiously, his voice drowned out by the cacophony. I clutched my knife, backing into the corner of the RV. My ears rang with the sound, and my mind screamed for it to stop. Then, all at once, the tapping ceased. The silence was so sudden and absolute that it was almost worse. I held my breath, waiting, listening. From outside came a single voice, low and guttural. My grip on the knife tightened. This wasn't over, not even close. Hashtag part 4, the confrontation, first 500 words. The swamp was silent again, but it was a silence that felt alive, like it was waiting for something. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crouched by the kitchenette, clutching the knife in one hand and gripping Bailey's collar with the other. His growls rumbled low, vibrating through the small space like a warning. Jessica, let us in, the voice repeated, slow and deliberate. It sounded close, too close. I forced myself to look out the window, lifting the corner of the blinds just enough to see. They were still there, all 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing. They hadn't moved, but somehow their presence felt more oppressive. The moonlight cast their elongated shadows across the swamp, distorting their already grotesque shapes. I had to think. I couldn't stay here, not with the vent broken and these things surrounding the RV. But running felt just as dangerous. What if they were faster? What if they were waiting to corner me in the trees? The tapping started again, this time on the rear of the RV. My head snapped in the direction of the sound, and Bailey barked furiously. The tapping turned to banging, heavy and rhythmic, as though someone was pounding on the back door. Stay calm, Jess, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the noise. The banging stopped as suddenly as it started. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I strained to hear any movement, but all I could make out was the soft rustle of the trees outside. My eyes darted to the door. Was it locked? I couldn't remember if I'd checked it. Before I could move, the doorknob rattled violently, the sound cutting through the silence like a scream. My heart leapt into my throat as I stared, paralyzed, at the door. It's not real. This isn't real, I muttered, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. But it was real. The door shook harder, and a voice, low and guttural, growled, "Open the door." Bailey lunged forward, barking wildly, his body slamming against the door as if he could keep it closed himself. The noise was deafening now, banging, scratching, growling, like the RV was under siege. I snapped into action, running to the door and bracing my body against it. My hands fumbled with the lock, making sure it was secure. "Get away!" I screamed, slamming my fist against the door. The banging stopped again. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening, my breath hitching. A low guttural laugh came from the other side, followed by words that made my blood run cold. "You can't hide, Jessica. We'll find a way in." I stumbled backward, my legs shaking as I clutched the knife. The air felt too thin, my chest tightening with fear. They were playing with me, breaking me down bit by bit. The roof creaked above me, and my stomach dropped. They weren't going to wait for me to open the door. They were coming in another way. Hashtag part 4, the confrontation, second 500 words. The creaking on the roof grew louder, more deliberate, as if something heavy was crawling across the RV. My hands trembled as I gripped the knife, my mind racing. I couldn't see them anymore, but I knew they were there, above me, surrounding me. Bailey barked furiously, his body rigid as he stared at the ceiling. His bark turned into a growl, and then a sharp whine as the RV rocked slightly, the metal groaning under the weight of whatever was up there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it at the vent, the one that had already been cracked open earlier. It was still partially ajar, and my stomach clenched when I noticed fresh scratches on the plastic, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. "Not again," I muttered, my voice barely audible over the thudding above me. The RV rocked again, this time harder, as if one of them had jumped onto the roof. The sound of scraping claws dragged across the metal, sending shivers down my spine. I backed away from the vent, clutching the knife so tightly my fingers ached. Then, a new sound. It started softly, a whisper, low and guttural, slipping through the broken vent. I couldn't make out the words at first, but the tone was unmistakably mocking, taunting. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like multiple voices blending into a sinister chorus. "Jessica, let us in, we're so close." The words swirled around me, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. My head spun as I tried to block them out, but they were relentless, digging into my mind like claws. Bailey barked again, snapping me out of my trance. I forced myself to focus, my eyes darting between the vent and the windows. I needed to act. Staying inside was a death sentence. These things were toying with me, and it was only a matter of time before they found a way in. The flashlight flickered as I moved toward the back of the RV, where my emergency supplies were stored. I grabbed a flare gun from the cabinet, my hands shaking as I loaded a single round into the chamber. It wasn't much, but it was something. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above, and the roof dented inward as something slammed against it. The force shook the RV, knocking over a few items from the counter. My flashlight fell from my hand, rolling under the table. I scrambled to grab it, but before I could, the vent popped open with a sharp snap. A pale skeletal hand reached through, its fingers impossibly long and clawed. I screamed, stumbling backward, and raised the flare gun instinctively. "Get out!" I yelled, pulling the trigger. The flare shot upward, slamming into the hand with a burst of light and heat. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek, pulling its hand back as smoke billowed through the vent. The RV shook again, this time with frantic, retreating movements. Whatever was on the roof was no longer in control. It was scrambling to escape. For a moment, the swamp fell silent again. But I knew this wasn't the end. Hashtag Part 4. The confrontation, third 500 words. The shriek from the creature still echoed in my ears as I stood frozen, the flare gun shaking in my hands. Smoke from the fired round drifted lazily through the cracked vent, the acrid smell mixing with the damp, earthy scent of the swamp. Bailey whined, pacing nervously beside me. I took a cautious step toward the door, straining to hear anything outside. At first, there was nothing, just the heavy, suffocating silence of the swamp. But then I heard it. The footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the RV like a predator stalking its prey. The sound of wet, heavy feet squishing in the mud sent chills racing down my spine. I gripped the knife tighter, the blade glinting in the faint light from the flashlight I had retrieved. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The handle rattled again, this time with more force, as if the creature, or creatures, were testing the lock. Bailey barked ferociously, lunging toward the door, his claws scraping against the floor. I grabbed his collar, pulling him back. "Stay with me, boy," I whispered, though my voice was barely steady. Then the banging started. It was loud and violent, shaking the entire RV with each impact. Whatever was out there wasn't holding back anymore. It wanted in, and it wasn't going to stop until it got through. I backed away, my mind racing. I couldn't wait for them to break in. I had to act. My eyes darted to the small back window near the kitchenette. It was small enough that they might not be watching it, but just big enough for me and Bailey to squeeze through. "Come on, Jess. You can do this," I muttered, trying to muster the courage to move. I grabbed my backpack and secured it tightly. Slinging it over one shoulder, I clipped Bailey's leash to his collar and gave him a reassuring pat. He was tense but obedient. his eyes locked on me as if waiting for direction. The banging grew louder, more frantic. The sound of splintering wood sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I darted toward the window, throwing it open with one swift motion. Cool, humid air rushed in, carrying the swamp's earthy smell. "Bailey, go!" I whispered urgently, guiding him through the opening. He scrambled out, landing softly on the damp ground outside. I hoisted myself up, my hands slipping slightly on the wet frame, and tumbled out after him. My knees hit the ground hard, but I didn't have time to feel the pain. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it around, scanning the area for any sign of the creatures. The swamp was still, but I knew better than to trust the calm. A loud crash came from behind me, and I turned to see the RV door swing open violently. Shadows spilled out from inside, and I caught a glimpse of those distorted, two long limbs moving toward us. "Run!" I shouted, and Bailey took off into the swamp, pulling me with him. The chase had begun. Part 4, The Confrontation. Fourth 500 words. The swamp was a maze of shadows and noise, as Bailey and I sprinted into the darkness. My flashlight's beam bounced erratically, illuminating flashes of twisted trees and tangled roots. But it wasn't enough to calm the growing panic in my chest. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit were unmistakable. Wet, heavy footsteps, and guttural growls that sent chills down my spine. Bailey tugged hard on the leash, his instincts guiding us deeper into the swamp. I could barely keep up, my boots slipping on the damp ground. My lungs burned with each labored breath, and the straps of my backpack dug into my shoulders. But stopping wasn't an option. A shrill, inhuman screech rang out from somewhere behind us, closer than I wanted to admit. My heart leapt into my throat as I glanced back, the flashlight catching a glimpse of one of the creatures. Its elongated limbs moved unnaturally as it tore through the underbrush, its hollow black eyes fixed on me. "Faster, Bailey!" I gasped, nearly tripping over a fallen branch. The swamp seemed alive around us, its thick foliage reaching out to slow us down. Branches snagged at my clothes, and the mud sucked at my boots with every step. Bailey barked sharply, yanking me to the left as we narrowly avoided a deep pool of stagnant water. The flashlight flickered, its beam faltering just as we reached a small clearing. I slapped it against my thigh, desperate to keep it alive. The light stabilized, but the reprieve was brief. In the silence that followed, I realized the footsteps had stopped. I froze, pulling Bailey close and crouching low. The swamp was unnervingly quiet, the usual chorus of insects and frogs conspicuously absent. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to hear anything, any sign of where they were. And then, from somewhere to my right, came the faint sound of whispering. "Jessica," the voice called, low and taunting. It wasn't alone. A second voice joined it, then a third, their words blending into a sinister chorus that seemed to echo from all directions. "Stay calm," I whispered, though my hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. I scanned the clearing, the beam catching nothing but trees and shadows. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they felt like they were crawling into my head. I clenched my teeth, willing myself to focus. Bailey barked again, this time at something ahead of us. My stomach dropped as I saw one of the creatures emerge from the shadows, its grotesque grin stretching impossibly wide. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Behind us, another figure appeared, cutting off our retreat. I spun the flashlight wildly, realizing we were surrounded. They moved closer, their hollow eyes locked on me, their whispers turning into low, guttural growls. Desperation took over. I grabbed the flare gun from my backpack, fumbling to reload it as the creatures closed in. "Stay back!" I screamed, raising the weapon with trembling hands. The lead creature lunged and I fired. The flare erupted in a blinding flash, striking it square in the chest. It let out a blood-curdling screech, its body collapsing into the swamp. But the others didn't stop. They were coming, relentless and unyielding. ## Part 4, The Confrontation. Fifth 500 words. The flare's searing light faded as the creature writhed on the ground, its inhuman screeches echoing through the swamp. For a fleeting moment, I thought the others might retreat. Instead, they surged forward, their distorted limbs moving with terrifying speed, their guttural growls filling the air. "Run, Bailey!" I shouted, yanking the leash as I bolted toward the densest part of the swamp. The trees closed in around us, their thick trunks and hanging moss providing some semblance of cover. My heart pounded in my chest as I navigated the uneven terrain, the creature's relentless pursuit driving me forward. Bailey barked wildly, his frantic pace forcing me to keep up. The flashlight trembled in my hand, its narrow beam casting frantic, flickering light on the path ahead. I could hear the snapping of branches and the wet squelch of footsteps closing in behind us. We broke through the trees into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive gnarled cypress tree with roots sprawling outward like skeletal fingers. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, as I realized we were trapped. There was no way forward, only murky water and more dense swamp. Bailey growled low in his throat, his body rigid as he stared back at the tree line. I turned, raising the flashlight just as the first creature emerged from the shadows. Its pale, elongated form looked even more grotesque in the harsh light. The grin on its face stretched wider, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. "Jessica!" it rasped, the sound like nails on glass. Behind it the others appeared, their hollow eyes glinting with malicious intent. They moved slowly, almost savoring the moment, their whispers blending into a chilling, dissonant hum. I backed up until my heel hit the edge of the water. My mind raced, searching for any option, any way to escape. The flare gun was useless now, and my knife felt laughably small against these towering, unnatural figures. Bailey barked again, snapping me out of my panic. I glanced at the massive cypress tree, its roots creating a network of natural crevices and hiding spots. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Come on, boy," I said, pulling Bailey toward the largest opening. We squeezed into the narrow gap between the roots, crouching low as the creatures advanced. My breathing was shallow, my entire body trembling as I watched them through the tangled branches. They stopped just a few feet from the tree, their heads tilting in eerie unison as they searched for me. One of them reached out, its long fingers brushing against the bark. I held my breath, willing myself to stay silent, even as every instinct screamed for me to run. The whispers stopped. The swamp fell silent, the only sound my rapid heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then one of them spoke. "You can't hide forever, Jessica." The creature's grin widened, and it stepped closer, its claws scraping against the roots. I tightened my grip on the knife, preparing for the inevitable. This wasn't over. Not yet. ## Part 5, The Dawn and the Aftermath. First 500 words. The creatures loomed closer, their distorted figures blending with the shadows of the swamp. My grip on the knife tightened, sweat dripping down my face as I crouched beneath the massive cypress roots. Bailey was pressed against me, trembling but silent, as if he understood the dire stakes. The lead creature extended its clawed hand, brushing the bark of the root just inches from my hiding spot. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give us away. The guttural whispers started again, circling me like a storm. "Jessica!" the raspy voice called, twisting my name into something alien and sinister. "Come out! No more running!" I fought the urge to scream, to lash out, to make some desperate move. Instead, I focused on steadying my breathing, forcing myself to remain absolutely still. Every muscle in my body burned from the tension, but I didn't dare move. One of the creatures let out a shrill screech, the sound so sharp it made my ears ring. It clawed at the ground near my feet, its hollow eyes scanning the darkness with unnatural precision. They were searching, closing in, like a pack of predators. The first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees, casting faint light across the swamp. The creatures recoiled slightly, their movements hesitant in the growing light. My pulse quickened. Maybe the daylight would drive them back. The lead creature snarled, its grin faltering as the sunlight touched its pale skin. The others hissed, their voices rising in an angry chorus. They began to retreat, their elongated limbs folding in on themselves as they backed away into the shadows. "Don't stop now," I whispered to myself, clinging to the faint hope that the light was my salvation. Bailey barked, his sharp sound echoing through the swamp. It was enough to push the creatures further into the trees. They paused at the edge of the clearing, their hollow eyes locked on me one last time. "This isn't over," the lead creature rasped, its voice carrying a chilling finality. Then, with a fluid, unnatural motion, they melted into the swamp, their figures disappearing into the misty underbrush. I didn't move for several minutes, frozen in place as the sunlight grew stronger. Of insects returned, as though the nightmare had lifted with the night. Finally, I exhaled, collapsing against the roots as the adrenaline drained from my body. Bailey licked my face, his tail wagging tentatively. I hugged him tightly, tears streaming down my face as I realized we had survived. But even as I sat there, bathed in the safety of the morning light, the creature's final words echoed in my mind. This wasn't over. I had escaped for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting for the next time darkness fell. Hashtag 5 the dawn and the aftermath, second 500 words. The morning sun bathed the swamp in a deceptive calm, its golden light reflecting off the murky water and filtering through the gnarled branches above. My breathing slowed, though my heart still pounded with residual terror. Bailey pressed close to me, his body trembling less now that the creatures were gone, for the moment. "We made it, boy," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. The swamp may have appeared tranquil, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a mask, hiding something darker just beneath the surface. I stood shakily, my legs sore from crouching and running. My clothes were damp, covered in mud and sweat, but I didn't care. My only thought was getting out of this place. I checked my backpack, ensuring I still had my map, my knife, and a few supplies. The flare gun was empty now, but I kept it tucked into my waistband, a small comfort even in its useless state. Bailey and I made our way cautiously back toward the RV. The path felt different in the daylight, the oppressive weight of the swamp's darkness replaced with an almost unsettling serenity. Every rustle of leaves, every ripple in the water made me flinch, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The RV came into view, its battered frame leaning slightly to one side. The door hung ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, my stomach twisting. Something about the sight of it felt wrong, like it no longer belonged to me but to whatever had been hunting us. "Stay close, Bailey," I murmured, stepping forward. I entered cautiously, the floor creaking beneath my weight. The interior was a mess, drawers yanked open, supplies scattered, and the vent above still cracked and clawed. The faint smell of smoke lingered from the flare I'd fired. Bailey sniffed around, his ears twitching nervously. "Let's grab what we need and get out of here," I said, mostly to calm myself. I packed quickly, stuffing food, water, and whatever essentials I could find into my bag. My eyes kept darting to the broken vent, half expecting to see a pale, clawed hand reaching through again. But the RV remained still, almost too still, as if the swamp itself were holding its breath. As I loaded Bailey into the RV, I noticed something etched into the doorframe. Long, jagged scratches, deeper and more deliberate than before. My stomach churned as I traced them with my fingers, realizing they weren't random. They formed a single word: Jessica. I stumbled back, my blood running cold. They had been inside, even after the chase, and they had left me a message. "This isn't over," I muttered, echoing the creature's chilling warning. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, the RV rumbling to life. I needed to get as far away from this place as possible. But as the swamp faded behind me, the scratches on the doorframe stayed burned into my mind. Whatever those things were, they knew my name, and I knew they weren't finished with me. #5, the dawn and the aftermath, third 500 words. The road out of the swamp was narrow and uneven, winding through dense trees and patches of waterlogged ground. The RV groaned with every bump, its battered frame reflecting the chaos of the night before. Bailey sat on the passenger seat, his head resting on my lap. His body was calm now, but his eyes darted toward every shadow outside the window. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as I focused on the road ahead. The swamp seemed to stretch on forever, every turn revealing more of the same gnarled trees and stagnant pools. It felt as though the place was trying to hold me back, unwilling to let me leave. In the rearview mirror, I kept glancing at the scratches on the doorframe. The jagged letters spelling my name felt like a brand, a mark I couldn't escape. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How had they known my name? What did they want? And why hadn't they killed me when they had the chance? The sunlight grew stronger as the swamp thinned out, and the dirt road gave way to gravel. My relief was short-lived. In the distance, I spotted a wooden sign marking the edge of the wildlife refuge. It should have brought comfort, but instead, it filled me with dread. I slowed the RV as I approached the sign. Scribbled across its weathered surface in what looked like dried mud, or something darker, were the same words I'd seen in the notebook back at the cabin. "They're watching." I stared at the message, my hands trembling on the wheel. It wasn't a coincidence. They were sending me a warning, or maybe a promise. Either way, it was clear that leaving the swamp didn't mean I was safe. Bailey let out a low whine, shifting nervously beside me. I pressed the gas pedal, leaving the sign, and the swamp, behind. The highway stretched ahead, a stark contrast to the oppressive swamp. The open road should have felt freeing, but instead, it left me exposed. The scratches on the doorframe felt like they were burning into my back, a constant reminder that the creatures weren't done with me. When I reached a small gas station on the outskirts of a nearby town, I pulled in and parked. My hands were shaking so badly I turned off the engine. I sat there for a moment, staring at the pumps, trying to convince myself I was finally safe. But even as I stepped out of the RV, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every movement, every shadow seemed to carry a threat. I filled the tank quickly, keeping Bailey close and glancing over my shoulder at every sound. The clerk inside the station gave me a strange look as I approached the counter. I realized I must have looked terrible. Mud-streaked clothes, wide eyes, and trembling hands. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice casual but curious. "You could say that," I muttered, sliding some cash across the counter. As I turned to leave, he called after me. "Be careful out there. This area's got some strange stories." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I was already living one of those stories, and deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Even as I drove away from the gas station, the swamp clinging to the horizon in my rearview mirror, The creature's parting words echoed in my mind. "We'll find you." I thought I could escape to the peace of the wilderness. Instead, I found something far worse. The swamp doesn't let go of its secrets, and now, neither can I. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this video with someone who loves a good scare. And let us know in the comments, what would you do if you were in Jessica's shoes?